Thank you all for joining our TRED Talk this evening. I'm Jessica Karlsruher, Executive Director of TRED Coalition, and will be your moderator. TRED is a nonpartisan, member-based organization that educates, advocates for, and defends landowners and rural communities they live in at the federal, state, and local levels. TRED Talks is part of our educational programming that connects landowners, experts, legislators, and the general public on issues affecting rural landowners and their communities across the state. Our panel discussions cover issues like conservation, rural education, eminent domain, broadband, and water, which brings us to tonight's discussion, Groundwater 101 for the state of Texas. I've put my contact information in the chat box, and you can submit questions to our panelists with the Q&A button that's located at the bottom on the right-hand side, and we will be sure to address those questions at the end of our panel discussion. For those of you watching on our social channels, you can leave comments or you can send questions to jessica@tredcoalition.org. With us this evening are 4 seasoned panelists who will share their expertise on groundwater and discuss different facets of this issue. Robert Mace is the Executive Director and Chief Water Policy Officer at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment and a professor of practice in the Department of Geography at Texas State University. He has more than 30 years experience in hydrology, hydrogeology, stakeholder processes, and water policy. Before joining Texas State, Robert worked at the Texas Water Development Board for 18 years, ending his career there as the Deputy Executive Director for the Water Science and Conservation Office. While at the board, Robert worked on understanding groundwater and surface water resources in Texas, advancing water conservation and innovative water technologies such as desalination, aquifer storage, recovery, reuse, and rainwater harvesting, regional and state water planning, and protecting Texans from floods. Prior to joining the Texas Water Development Board, he worked for 9 years at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin as a hydrologist and a research scientist. Robert has a BS in geophysics, an MS in hydrology from New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, and a PhD in hydrogeology from the University of Texas at Austin. Next, we have Leah Martinson, who is the Executive Director of the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts. She recently relocated to Texas from Colorado, where she was practicing as a water rights attorney for more than 15 years. In her legal practice, she represented the interests of a wide range of water users, from municipal water providers to agricultural well users. In addition to obtaining new water rights and protecting existing rights for her clients, Leah also participated in Colorado's state water planning process and associated water-related legislation. She has been active in Colorado's efforts to develop alternative methods to permanent transfers of agricultural water to meet growing municipal demands, including the development and implementation of a temporary land fallowing water leasing system. Leah obtained her undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin and her law degree from the University of Colorado Boulder. Vanessa Puig-Williams is the director of the Texas Water Program at the Environmental Defense Fund and leads their efforts to advance sustainable groundwater management in Texas. The program focuses on enabling the state's groundwater conservation districts to effectively manage groundwater resources, considering the long-term needs of all users. This includes rural communities, surface water users, and ecosystems that depend on groundwater or groundwater-dependent rivers and streams. Prior to joining the Environmental Defense Fund, Vanessa was the executive director of the Trinity Edwards Springs Protection Association. It's a landowner organization focused on protecting property rights and groundwater resources in the Hill Country. Vanessa received her JD from UT Law School and practices as a water and environmental attorney. Vanessa has advised landowners and nonprofits on issues related to land and water conservation and practiced in the environmental division of the Texas Attorney General's office. A Texas native, Vanessa is passionate about educating partners, funders, and people about why Texas must sustainably manage our water resources to ensure a resilient future. When she's not writing or talking about groundwater, Vanessa enjoys camping with her 2 boys and husband in their Airstream and running around Lady Bird Lake. Last but certainly not least, we have Lairy Johnson, who is an experienced environmental and sustainability engineer. He has spent most of his career in establishing world-class programs and environmental sustainability results. He has worked as a hydrologist, environmental engineer, sustainability engineer, and EHS manager, and just recently retired. He has led soil and groundwater remediation projects throughout Texas and the Southwest, like compliance programs at a copper smelter and establishing sustainability programs such as landfill-free and energy water reduction programs at a large brewery. Most recently at Molson Coors Brewery, he worked closely with the company's government affairs and sustainability teams to actively promote Miller Coors water sustainability programs in the state of Texas, with particular focus on enhancing the water quality and quantity of the Trinity River, Richland Chambers watershed, the major source of water for the Fort Worth Brewery. Working with the NGOs and the U.S. Natural Resources Conservation Service, this watershed stewardship program has benefited over 100 landowners who have engaged in water conservation practices encompassing over 50,000 acres to date. Since 2012, the program has saved almost 9 billion gallons of water. In addition, Lairy has testified before the Texas House of Representatives Natural Resource Committee on Molson Coors water sustainability practices conducted both inside and outside the brewery, while as a casebook example of how to engage both private landowners and corporations to address current water issues facing the state of Texas. Lairy has a bachelor's and a master's from Stephen F. Austin University. So I thank you all for being here with us tonight. And as I mentioned, this is Groundwater 101, as you will discover this evening, but also from the extensive bios and experience of our panelists, we will be needing to have many more discussions on groundwater as it relates to Texans and what we can do to help conserve and preserve this natural resource in our state. So let's jump right into it. And Leah, I would like to start with you. What is groundwater and how is it important to Texas?
So I'm going to laugh right off the bat because I had expected Robert to take that question.
I'll grade your response.
As I prepared, I actually did not have that one with my name next to it.
Robert's next. He just has more time.
So, I mean, groundwater is the groundwater that is in the aquifers that underlie the land surface. It's part of the water cycle. So it is connected, aquifers recharge. It can be connected via streams. But as a general matter, it's the water that is filling up the spaces under the surface of the earth. And it's important because it is a significant source of the water that we rely on in Texas. It is, I think, 60%, I believe, Robert, of the water used in Texas is groundwater?
That's correct.
Yeah, so Robert, I actually wanted to go.
I'll give you an A.
Yeah, so Robert, let's continue that. Your explanation of groundwater. When we first met, you were explaining surface water versus groundwater, and then how aquifers come into play. So let's talk about that. And what is an aquifer? What does it do? How many do we have in our state? And how does that play into groundwater?
So an aquifer is geologic formation filled with water, and it produces usable amounts of water. Now, what's interesting about how scientists define aquifers is that it's not like a set definition. I have 12 textbooks on my shelf, and each one has a slightly different definition. And it's also, an aquifer is from the perspective of who's using it. So if you have a ranch that has a hand-dug well that's 30 feet deep that barely seeps out water to meet your needs, that's your aquifer. But San Antonio, for example, wouldn't consider that an aquifer for their purposes. So really an aquifer is just anything that produces water that's usable, and it may depend on the perspective of who's using it. We're blessed in Texas with a lot of groundwater and a lot of aquifers. We have 9 major aquifers. I'm gonna go ahead and, being part professor, I have slides ready to go. We have 9 major aquifers across the state, and these cover a large part of the state. And a major aquifer is an aquifer that gets, I call it big water over a large area. And big water, by that I mean you can get a really good well out of this. We also have 22 what we as a state call minor aquifers. And don't be insulted if this is your aquifer and you're thinking, man, I wish I had a major aquifer, or my minor aquifer is major to me. These are either big water over a small area or small water over a big area. And when you add these two maps together, There's pretty much almost every place in Texas you drill a hole, you'll get some amount of groundwater. Not everywhere. There are places where you can't get enough water.
And so how much of the groundwater is supplied by aquifers? And kind of explain the recharge.
So recharge is when water it infiltrates at the land surface, gets past the root zone, and then percolates down to the water table. And so it's when that water hits the water table, that's when we call it recharge. In Texas, the overall water budget for the state, 86% on average of the rainfall goes back up into the sky, either from direct evaporation or evapotranspiration, which is basically plant sweat, plants intercepting it. And so whatever makes it past the root zone will then recharge the aquifers. And so that's replenishing it. Before there's any pumping, groundwater does what I call what goes down must come up. Kind of the opposite of gravity, although groundwater is influenced strongly by gravity. And by that I mean, whatever recharges needs to come up somehow. And so before there was pumping, it would come up through springs, through base flow to rivers. Once pumping came along, that was kind of competition for the groundwater that was going to the springs and the rivers. And so groundwater pumping can intercept that flow and accordingly affect base flow to rivers and affect springs.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, groundwater is so critical to keeping our streams and rivers flowing in the state. The Water Development Board did an analysis several years ago, and I think that approximately 30% of the water that's flowing in rivers across the state actually originates as groundwater. So those two systems are certainly connected.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so what was the distinction made between surface water and groundwater? How did that come about?
Well, there's a lot to that question. I don't know if you're referring to like the legal distinction or the hydrogeological one, which is
legal distinction.
Yeah,
okay.
The legal distinction. So I don't know if I could tell you the history of how it came about, but in Texas, surface water is owned by the state and it's managed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCQ. They basically give entities usufructuary rights. So they have, they don't own the groundwater, they have the right to use it under the prior appropriation system.
Don't own the surface water.
Surface water,
yeah.
Right. So it's first in time, first in right. But with groundwater, which is what we're going to really focus on today, it's privately owned by overlying landowners and managed by local groundwater conservation districts, which Leah will tell you more about.
I'm not an attorney, so you can correct me, but usufructuary rights, surface water is a private property right.
Right. It's a real property right. Yes.
Yeah. So it can be bought and sold.
It's a vested right.
Yeah.
Well, so what is the difference between a water table aquifer and an artesian aquifer?
Hey, I've got a slide for that. So water table aquifer, here's what a water table aquifer looks like. It's also called an unconfined aquifer. And so the water level in the aquifer, so this here is your aquifer material. So let's call it sand, land surface. And then there's a low flow boundary. And we have a little well in here with a screen in it. And so in a water table aquifer, you put a well in, the water level in your well is the same as the water level in the aquifer. And based on recharge and discharge, the water table can go up and down. Rainy season, it might come up, dry season, it might go down. Confined aquifer, the aquifer material is bounded on the top and the bottom such that the water in the aquifer is under pressure. And so when you put a well in this aquifer and let it sit, the water level will rise above the top of the aquifer. In some cases, the water level will actually rise above the land surface, and you'll have an artesian flowing well. And there's still some of those, believe it or not, in Texas.
That's great. I love the visuals. That's helpful. And so, Vanessa, what does rule of capture mean, and what does that mean for landowners?
Well, the rule of capture is sort of an infamous legal doctrine in Texas, where basically it prohibits one landowner from suing another landowner who negatively impacts another landowner's well by pumping groundwater. And it was adopted by the courts, by the Texas Supreme Court in Texas back in the early 1900s, and has not really been overturned in our court system. But your question about what it means to landowners, well, it means several things. I mean, in an area where we don't have groundwater conservation districts, it means that, you know, you can basically pump as much groundwater as you want, and if that interferes with your neighbor, well, that's, you know, they're out of luck. But for the rest of the state, and about 2/3 of the state is covered by a groundwater conservation district, it means that if you are a landowner and want to develop your groundwater resources, you do have to interact with these entities that we have in Texas called groundwater conservation districts. And so I'll let Leah, you know, explain what those do, because that's what Leah does every day is work with groundwater conservation districts.
Yes, so Leah, in 1917, the Texas legislature passed an amendment to the Texas Constitution allowing for the creation of these conservation districts. So what is a groundwater conservation district and how are they created?
Oh, Leah, you're on mute.
Thank you. Of course, the mistake of the last 18 months. So just to clarify, so in 1917, the Conservation Amendment didn't actually authorize the creation of groundwater conservation districts. Instead, what that did was it laid the foundation for their eventual ability to be created. And what that did was it said, yes, the legislature has the right to regulate natural resources in the state, pass laws about them, groundwater being one of those. It wasn't until 1949 that the legislature actually passed the first law that allowed for the creation of groundwater conservation districts in Texas. We've seen now since then, and that law has changed over time, but the fundamental idea of having these groundwater conservation districts managing groundwater in Texas has persisted throughout. The idea was then, it still is now, that the groundwater resource should be managed locally. That allows for the regulation of the groundwater resource to reflect local conditions, local preferences. It also means those regulators are closer to what is being regulated. They're more responsive, they're more accountable, they're more accessible. So this idea of groundwater conservation districts being the state's preferred method for groundwater management has continued throughout. So in 1951, we saw a first groundwater conservation district form. Fast forward to today, we've got, as the map you just pulled up shows, we've got 98 groundwater conservation districts. Groundwater conservation districts are political subdivisions of the state, so they have powers that are expressly granted to them by the legislature. They can do what the legislature says they can do. They are given specific authority to manage groundwater, and in that charge, the legislature has charged them with preserving, conserving, protecting, recharging, and preventing the waste of groundwater, while at the same time protecting the private property rights of landowners in that groundwater and allowing for the highest practicable level of groundwater production. So That's what groundwater conservation districts do in a nutshell.
And so why would there, or what is the reason, if there is one, for there being areas that do not have a groundwater conservation district?
So groundwater conservation districts can be created in a number of ways. They can be, and one of them is by legislative action, and that's typically going to happen because a local community approaches their legislator and says, hey, we would like to create a groundwater conservation district in our county or in our region in these number of counties. So groundwater conservation districts and really tend to be created where the community, where they want it. There are other methods. TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, can initiate the creation of groundwater conservation districts. Landowners can similarly petition for that creation, but at the end of the day, through all of those methods, practically speaking, end with a confirmation election. That the local community votes on whether or not they want that groundwater conservation district formed. So that's, you know, why you have some in some areas and not, and then kind of the technical legal creation piece. But then there's a practical component, which is where is groundwater most used? You know, Robert pulled up that map showing where the aquifers in the state were. I think what you tend to see, it's not an exact match, but groundwater conservation districts exist where there is groundwater, more groundwater in need of regulation. So areas that have very little groundwater, for example, or very few people, you may not have a groundwater conservation district.
Okay.
It's kind of like you don't really need a groundwater conservation district until you need one.
Right.
Oftentimes, you know, it's in areas where there is more pressure on those groundwater resources, and the local communities there realize that it's in their best interest to have a management entity that can, you know, work on their behalf to protect and conserve those resources. Yeah,
and interestingly, groundwater conservation districts, this percentage may have changed, but approximately 72%, GCDs overlie 72% of the major and minor aquifers in Texas. So they really do cover the, you know, the vast majority of those aquifer systems.
And it's about 90% of all the groundwater pumped in the state is covered by the current distribution of groundwater districts.
Yeah, I was actually, the statistic I have was 85%, but I assumed that had probably changed since wherever I pulled that from.
Well, your statistic was different because it was aerial coverage of districts and aquifers, but.
Right, and then the second one, how much groundwater produced in Texas is within a groundwater conservation district. Yeah.
Some of them are head scratchers though, like why they don't have one. And I know in a few cases it's just concern about another level of government and paying taxes and perhaps regulation preventing development.
Yeah, I mean it does become. I mean the whole idea with it being ground up is that it's something that the local community wants, and sometimes the local community doesn't want it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, so what tools do groundwater conservation districts have available to manage groundwater?
Yeah, so all of their powers, like I said, are expressly granted. You find those in what's known as Chapter 36 of the Texas Water Code. It's possible that when a specific groundwater conservation district was created, they may have been given more or less powers that are in Chapter 36. So that's just something to keep in mind, that in their specific enabling legislation, there might be some modifications from Chapter 36. But what Chapter 36 lays out is it gives them a number of tools, and the big tasks for groundwater conservation districts are well permitting and enforcing their rules and regional planning. Districts also do things like monitor wells, they conduct research and science, they do education, and what, you know, may monitor for water quality. But when it comes to their rules and well permitting, they have two main tools to do that. One is to regulate the spacing of wells. So how close two wells are to each other, or how close a well can be to a property line, or maybe both. And what that is intended to do is avoid well-to-well interference, ensuring that one well doesn't pump in a way that dries up another well. So you're going to avoid that kind of micro impact. And then the other one is through production limitations, whether that be volumetric or rate limitations on how much of the resource, an individual well is allowed to withdraw from that common pool in the aquifer.
So Robert, what is the difference between a groundwater conservation district, a subsidence district, or the Edwards Aquifer Authority?
For groundwater conservation district, they generally all tie back to Chapter 36 of the Texas Water Code, and so their powers originate from there. Although, as Leah mentioned, when the legislature creates a district, the district might modify their powers, grant them more, or take some powers away. Subsidence districts in the Edwards Aquifer Authority are not part of Chapter 36, although interestingly they used to be. So over the last 10 years or so, they've kind of written themselves out. They're like special districts in the sense that they've received very specific marching orders from the legislature to achieve goals in their aquifers, and they've also received, maybe Leah or Vanessa can pipe in, I think, some extra powers or abilities to do their job. So the subsidence districts, they're about controlling groundwater production such that it doesn't cause the land to sink. And so there's parts of Houston that have sunk more than 10 feet due to groundwater pumping. And given how close they are to the Gulf Coast, the San Jacinto Monument, right, one of the holy grounds of Texas, was sinking into the Gulf of Mexico because of groundwater pumping. So the Harris Galveston Coastal Subsidence District does a great job in managing that resource. In the case of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, it was created in response to a threat from a federal judge, pretty much of a federal takeover of the management of the Edwards Aquifer to protect endangered species in San Marcos and Comal Springs. And so the legislature's response to ensure that there was still state/local control was the creation of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, charged to protect those endangered species.
And I would say, like, one interesting thing about the Edwards Aquifer Authority that's different from how the other groundwater conservation districts in Chapter 36 manage is that they actually have a cap on production from the Edwards. So there are no new permits that are issued, which has created a market for water in the Edwards. And that cap is sort of set at a threshold that will ensure that the springs, Comal and San Marcos Springs, continue to flow to maintain habitat for those endangered species that live there. But, all the people who need that water also, get the benefit of that spring system continuing to flow downstream.
Well, and so if groundwater is privately owned, how do groundwater districts manage a resource that's privately owned?
Well, that's the big question in Texas, that I think a lot of us and, on this call and other water stakeholders and groundwater districts in particular are wrestling with. So we, one kind of important case that came about a few years ago in 2012, actually was an outcome of the creation of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, is the Edwards Aquifer Authority versus Day, where basically the Texas Supreme Court held that landowners own their groundwater in place like oil and gas, and that it can be subject to a regulatory taking, for which, in that case, the Edwards Aquifer Authority needed to compensate this landowner. And so it really has created some uncertainty about how that holding extends to groundwater districts under Chapter 36, and if it does, to what extent can a district actually regulate groundwater without it becoming a taking? Those questions haven't really been answered, but what we do know is that the Texas Supreme Court has basically affirmed that groundwater districts exist to reasonably regulate groundwater, and they have a very important role and many different factors that they have to consider that are unique from oil and gas, like the different uses that that people need groundwater for, and the environmental uses that are also equally important, like the springs. And so I think your question about how they achieve this balance and I think has to do with the tools that the legislature has given them under Chapter 36, which are actually quite broad. And, when they're utilized in a reasonable manner and on the best available science that those districts have access to, I think that's how you do it. And, from my perspective, it's about managing the aquifers sustainably. That's how you ensure that a district is protecting, everybody's property rights over an aquifer, because, there are obviously landowners have different ideas of what they might want to do with their groundwater. But I think most landowners in Texas, view their groundwater as an important resource, both to them, but also to sort of the larger system that relies on that water. And so, they have this stewardship ethic. And so I think groundwater districts, when they manage more sustainably, protect both those landowners' interests and, basically all of them, so.
Well, and so even though groundwater is privately owned in Texas, there's limitations. So what is included versus what's not included in that?
Well, I think the limitations, that a landowner has to utilize or develop those groundwater resources really stem from Groundwater Conservation District's authority to regulate groundwater. I mean, the law is clear that although landowners own their groundwater in place, they're not necessarily entitled to a specific volume of groundwater. And where a groundwater conservation district exists, they may enact rules like Leah mentioned, spacing requirements, production limitations, in order to conserve that resource for the future.
Well, and I'm also curious from each of you, how do the responsibilities of groundwater conservation districts intersect with property rights and legal regulatory tensions that it creates?
Well, I guess maybe I would start this. It's, I was going to reiterate, and I think it goes to your question, what Vanessa said about the day case and what we know and what we don't know. I mean, I think there's a really big unanswered question, which is how far is too far? Because it becomes a taking of private property when you regulate too much, but we do not have direction on just how far is too far. And so what districts are doing is they are trying very, very mindfully to ensure that they aren't going too far without knowing exactly where that line is. They are looking at the resource. They want to every day be thinking about all of the private property rights. As Vanessa said, it's not just about the individual who wants to pump, it's about the person who doesn't want to pump or wants to pump 10 years from now. So they're looking at that resource. They're saying, here's how much is available. And our job is to essentially divvy it up in a way that's fair and equitable. There are different ways of doing that. Chapter 36 outlines a number of the different ways that they can do that, how they can do that allocation. And they're wrestling with it, and they're just trying to do the best that they can with the charge they've been given, which is this balancing act.
One neat thing about being so many districts, not everybody's a fan of so many districts, by the way, is that there's like a marketplace of ideas and approaches that are being tried and attempted and being legally challenged, I guess, as well. And then each court decision kind of reveals a little more maybe on what those limits are. But it does seem like there's a bit of uncertainty, legal uncertainty on how far a district can go. But it seems like the fair share thing, and what you said, Leah, about somebody who's not pumping today and wants to pump in the future, that's a big issue of like not cutting off folks that just they've conserved or not used it at this point and want to use it in the future, and they have the aquifer underneath them.
I do think we should make sure that we convey that there are exempt wells, and that groundwater districts cannot regulate exempt well production, and that would be for like domestic and livestock and household use. for over, what is it, over less than 25,000 gallons
Yeah, 25,000
a day.
gallons per day on 10 acres.
So yeah, so that is something that is available, you know, to all landowners to be able to access the water beneath their land for those purposes.
And so is there a permitting process for that, or how would a landowner go about knowing?
Yeah, so it's not permitting. It's an exempt well, so you are exempt from permitting requirements. However, districts do require registration of those wells because there are other things that districts are doing that it's important that all wells are complying with. Well construction standards, for example, you know, districts want to know where wells are. So there's a registration process. If you have a 10-acre parcel, that's what Chapter 36 says, 10 acres, and then you get a well, a domestic or a livestock well, 25,000 gallons per day. Districts can actually make that parcel size smaller. A number of them have. So like 2-acre parcel may qualify, or a 5-acre parcel. You still need to go in, you need to register that, you need to comply with well construction standards and all that kind of stuff. But you are not, and you need to ensure that that well isn't capable of producing more than that amount. But you do not have a permit. It's a registration.
And I think it's a good incentive to register your well, because if a big pumper comes in and is seeking a permit and the district doesn't know you have a well there, then they won't be worried about your well. And so if they know your well's there and they know how many, your neighbors have wells, then that could be considered as part of a permit.
Yes, that spacing, there's that spacing component. That's exactly right. That, even with exempt wells, the spacing matters to ensure you're not having that well-to-well interference.
Okay. Well, so with the rapid population growth in Texas, we're looking at ways to conserve and be more sustainable. So what are some opportunities and best practices for conserving groundwater? Larry, I'll pitch this one to you first.
All right. So, the whole conservation issue regarding groundwater is pretty much the same as, whether you're talking about surface water, rainwater, soils, just any kind of other resources. You've got to have the knowledge base and the passion to execute a sustainable program. I'm a recent landowner, and from what I've learned just with my neighbors, that these people that have come into this area, a lot of them just don't know how to manage their well or their surface water or their grasses. And so, in fact, Jessica, you remember when we were driving around, we even had like a little quick course on mowing strategies with a neighbor.
Right.
It's just with this rapid growth coming out. In fact, a friend of mine, he gets paid really, he makes a lot of money teaching these new landowners how to work the property, how to be responsible. And to me, I think that's where a lot of this it goes to. In fact, I have a groundwater conservation district here, but I don't have any information on it. In fact, I was writing notes now to, trying to look up on the internet, who do I need to talk to see what resources are available to promote conservation. So, that's number one. I think the conservation starts at home with the landowner. It's how you manage. Are you going to put native species grasses in? Are you going to do riparian, back spacing off of any plowing or agricultural type activities? Are you going to have rainwater catchment? The other one that we're not really talking about in impact to shallow aquifers is septics. That's basically a lot of an infusion of potential material into the aquifer that I'm not sure everybody would like that. So it starts with that education component, and with that education, a lot of things, a lot of positive things can come of it. The project that during my intro they talked about was the National Water Quality Initiative, and that was basically going to landowners and explaining to them what technologies are out there for their cow-calf operations or any kind of growing operations, that they can utilize, and that, you know, could be incentivized or you know, just any kind of you know, bonus for them to save water. Because, you know, anybody that's a landowner, you're really a steward of rainwater, you know, and that stewardship goes from rainwater to surface water to groundwater. And so I think a lot more education needs to be put out on that. You know, I mean, the Edwards Aquifer does a good job. The Tarrant Regional or the Trinity River guys, the TRWD guys, they did a real good job educating the community on what you can do as a homeowner, and or even a landowner. And so that's where generally a lot of what I try to do is on the education side.
And so for the other panelists, respective to your organizations, what are some either resources or tools that are readily available to educate folks about this conservation and sustainable practices?
I mean, I just maybe jump in right away. Groundwater conservation districts, a big part of what a lot of them do is education, really helping their communities understand the importance of groundwater, the importance of preserving that groundwater. And so they have programs, whether it's going out to the schools or, you know, rainwater harvesting classes that they're sponsoring and demonstration gardens. And so you do see at that groundwater conservation district level, in a lot of places, not every district has the budget for it, but in a lot of places, efforts to really get the word out and do that public education. Yeah,
and that goes a long way, that kind of education. I like what you said about getting out, you know, and doing the, you know, the rain trailer and things like that, because, you know, to watch the next generation light up and understand how important it is. That was always one of my favorite things, you know, when they brought out the rainwater simulator or you know, any one of those tools. It was just fantastic to see them light up, and I do believe it's a generational thing, and it's one of those journeys that I don't think will ever end in anybody's lifetime, because, you know, it's that important.
I'll throw in and help answer a question that somebody asked. Environmental Defense Fund and the Meadows Center are in a few weeks releasing a couple reports about kind of the status of groundwater sustainability of aquifers in the state. The Meadows Center and I'm the author of the report. We're focused on kind of quantifying how much is being pumped compared to a maximum sustainable amount of pumping, and also kind of looking at kind of the policy history of groundwater sustainability in Texas. And then EDF has done an analysis on like what groundwater conservation districts can do using the tools that are already in the toolbox with their broad powers to manage aquifers sustainably. We're also at the Meadows Center pretty active with OneWater, which is basically using the built environment as a source of supply. So one great example is the Wimberley OneWater School in Wimberley, Texas, that using rainwater harvesting that Larry mentioned, condensate harvesting from air conditioning, and then on-site wastewater reuse, and then using that water to water the grounds, lowered the planned use of the aquifer by 90%. So the only thing the well is used for is for drinking water. And so the rainwater and the condensate's used to flush toilets and flush urinals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like going to require a myriad of different options and solutions. I mean, when there's only so much fresh groundwater that's going to be around, and the state is continuing to grow. So, you know, we're going to have to look at other water sources, and reuse is a really important future water source. It's already an important one now, but, you know, looking at brackish groundwater, instead of doing reservoirs that evaporate, you know, ASR facilities are something that we're going to, I think, see more of as well. ASR is where you're injecting water and storing it underground for use later. And the city of Austin is considering building one in the future, and San Antonio already has one. So, you know, it's going to be a whole host of solutions that will help us conserve groundwater. It's not going to just be one thing.
Well, and what are some examples?
Yeah, and I was just going to piggyback onto that. You know, so you have the surface water. You know, back at the original drought of record back in the 1950s. That's when Texas went into a surface water construction frenzy, you could call it. In fact, that was I think that's one of those trivia questions that I always love. Is, you know, like, you know, how many natural lakes are there in the state of Texas originally? And it's not very many. I want to say the number's 1, and then the rest of the lakes that you see out there is all man-made, all these big reservoirs, and that came because they recognized that, you know, drought, you know, so many years, you have this huge population, you know, all these people that are moving in from California, New York, and everywhere else. They're not bringing infrastructure. They're not bringing roads. They're not bringing water resources. They're not bringing, you know, anything. But, you know, Texas is still going to have to figure a way to come up with those resources. And so it's not just, you know, landowners out there that need to do their part, but, you know, even like a homeowners, you know, one of the things that shocked me as a member of the city of Fort Worth, you know, retail water board, was the fact that, you know, over 70% of all the water that is sold by the city of Fort Worth was used for irrigation of lawns. You know, if you think about that, that's a city or a user area of over 1 million people, and 70% of all the water they used went to water grass. You know, if you want to talk about, you know, conservation, it needs to start, you know, the folks in the urban areas need to understand, you know, the water cycle, you know, and the landowners out in the rural areas need to understand that they really are water managers. You know, I haven't done the math yet, but, you know, my acreage times my 36 inches of water a year equals so many, you know, millions of gallons that I actually manage. And one of the things I want to do is make sure that that water is going to where it needs to go, and that is into the ground and into the proper surface areas. So.
Well, and what are some examples of sustainable water use that local business owners and corporations can undertake? Or are there already examples of what some businesses are doing?
Well, you know, the one that I was a part of with the Miller Coors, or now Molson Coors, that one was just absolutely a great program. You know, they were a large brewery, and when I say a large brewery, I mean, we're talking, you know, 270 million gallons of beer a year. You know, when I started working for them, they were buying probably 1 billion gallons of water a year. And when I left, it was just a little bit north of 600 million. And so we had huge reductions in what we were doing on site, because we knew our place in the community. You know, granted, what they called super user or heavy industrial was probably less than 3% of all the water used in the city of Fort Worth. But we understood that, you know, we were a large landowner or a large water user. In addition to that, we also had a goal, a sustainability goal, to work out into the community to find the watershed that we pulled our water from to make beer. And that was the Richland Chambers watershed. And we started funding and started an educational program with the NRCS. In fact, the Meadows folks, they steered us in the right direction to help us establish this initiative. And, you know, it doesn't sound like a lot when you look at a map. You know, the 100+ landowners and 50,000 acres is still like the head of a pin on the 2,000 square miles of the watershed, but it's still making an impact. You know, that's 9 million gallons that is going back to the surface water and to the groundwater. And it's just through, you know, practices that have been around for the landowners for, you know, millennium. I mean, it's, you know, cross fencing, herbaceous weed control, riparian, you know, don't get into the, you know, don't plow to the edge of your creeks, you know, make sure you got some buffer. stock tank construction, just simple things. And it's trying to get that education back, and a lot of these guys, they've been managing for 60, 70 years and they didn't want to hear from us, but their kids did. And to me, that told me, that, hey, we're making progress, and, it may not be this year, it may not be next year, but there's going to be a year when the newer generation starts doing a different level of implementation, and then that next generation will do a next level. And so, but that's something that can be done out there. It was, we had matching funds from the federal government to do this. We worked with the soil water conservation districts, and the beauty was that the company said that anybody that wanted to mirror it, any other company, they could, that we were supposed to help them. And unfortunately, there wasn't very many that came calling for that support or that help.
Something we haven't really touched on, but I do want to also mention is the, agricultural water conservation, particularly like up in the Panhandle, where they are very groundwater dependent, and the Ogallala is aquifer. It is being managed to be depleted. It does not recharge at the rate that it's being used, not even close. And so there is a very, very heavy focus, particularly in areas like that, on converting to highly efficient sprinkler systems, to doing research on different crops that are less water intensive, or different varieties that utilize and require less water. So, the groundwater conservation districts up there have programs to provide loans for those sprinklers. They have education centers, master irrigator programs. And so there are a lot of efforts in that space as well. The Texas Water Development Board has a grant program available for agricultural water conservation that goes to some of that stuff. I think we'd be remiss to not mention that.
And one other thing
that
Larry mentioned, I was just going to say that one other thing that Larry mentioned about landowners, really kind of being stewards of the groundwater resources under their land. I think as Texas is growing, there's going to be a need to really ensure that we leave groundwater in place. And we may need to start looking at solutions not unlike land conservation easements, but that are specific to water, where, we are paying landowners to keep their water underground because it provides a benefit, whether that's keeping a spring flowing or keeping groundwater levels in a state where a city needs to, have that available. There's, an important, San Antonio has done a really good job of that, but we need to, I think, look further out across the state about where we can utilize that more moving forward. That's how, the fact that we have, privately owned groundwater in Texas, I think that's going to be a really important way to conserve it moving forward.
Robert, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just amplify some of what's already been said. It's a multi-scale issue, and the cool thing about water is we all have a personal relationship with it, and so each of us can do things better with how we handle water. So like at my wife and our place in Austin, we don't use any city water outside. We have a 5,000 gallon rainwater tank, and we're in the core of the city. We use that for our outdoor needs and have water sense rated fixtures, and accordingly have a really low usage. And so anybody can seek to do that. And furthermore, I can drink one of those beers that Larry used to make, inside when it's 110 degrees out, and watch my neighbor mow his yard. And, I don't have to mow my yard because it's xeriscaped, and I use drought tolerant zoysia and just let it do its thing. And the yard still looks great.
Yeah, and can I add to that about the yard and the yard mowing, and appreciate you funding my retirement. One of the things I learned in the conservation world was about grass. So, you know, I was working with the field guys on a project, and they were talking about just Bermuda, which everybody uses. It's ubiquitous throughout, you know, most suburban areas. And the guys were saying, you know, how poorly we manage the grass that we're growing. You know, we all know St. Augustine's a water hog and needs lots of shade and stuff. And Bermuda, you know, it's one of those that turns brown in the winter, but it also turns brown in the summer, and it's very temperature dependent. And that was the key aspect that I think a lot of people don't understand. In fact, after working with these guys, I went like 10 years. I had a workhouse in Fort Worth for the brewery, and then we had the San Antonio property, and I stopped watering, and I maintained, you know, a St. Augustine lawn in the shaded areas of all the oak trees in San Antonio, and the Bermuda grass, you know, I kept, you know, 3-4 inches tall. My neighbor, he would make it like, you know, a putting surface, and that sucker would just burn. And he would never listen to me, and he'd always harass me because, you know, come end of August, my yard looked like straw, but I knew that, you know, the first rain, that grass would just take off, you know, because, you know, Bermuda is not a new grass. It's been around millions of years, and it survived, and it knows how. And so that was the aspect of, you know, working with the guys at the NRCS was that knowledge base that just, you know, in fact, my dad even, you know, has curtailed his water, his irrigation. And, you know, my sister has done the same thing. And, you know, but it took a lot of conversation with them to get them to into action. So, you know, but yeah, it was just, you know, my wife at first didn't understand. And, you know, once she saw that, hey, you know, I was still out there mowing my lawn every week, you know, regardless of whether it got watered or not or rained. You know, she was like, "Oh, it's still growing." I said, "Yeah, it doesn't need to get watered 3 or 4 times a week. You know, it just needs, you know, because that's not how it rains." And so it's, you know, it was huge. You know, it was huge. And so, you know, one day I need to challenge Robert about, you know, how much water everybody's using. You know, I think we had a contest a while back, but yeah, I think it's fantastic to hear stories like that. You know.
Well, thank you all. So we'll now open it up to questions. And the first one is, are there any projections regarding the ratio groundwater depletion versus groundwater replenishment? I assume it's aquifer dependent, but is there a list of aquifers that are under depleted faster than water being replenished?
So the answer is wait a couple weeks, and yes, it's not out there now. I think, as Leah mentioned, it's pretty well known about the Ogallala, which is pumped about 6.5 times the recharge rate. But we have a report coming out in a couple of weeks that's going to report on all the aquifers and how their production compares, kind of their production today, how it compares with we call a maximum sustainable pumping rate, and then also what the districts are planning for the future through their desired future conditions and how sustainable those are or are not. So stay tuned.
Is anyone in Texas or through your various water organizations working on establishing legal rights for natural features for water, land, and air?
So that's not something that we are working on at Environmental Defense Funds, at least in Texas, but I have heard that, you know, like
rights of nature. Yeah. That,
right,
I mean, it's been environmental philosophy for a long time, but I'm not sure much progress is being made in the US.
Yeah. But, you know, it's always interesting to me. I live right up the hill from Barton Springs. And so I'm always walking by the springs and seeing all the people enjoy the pool and the creek and kayaking and swimming and fishing. And, you know, the reason that spring is flowing today is because of, you know, the endangered species, the salamander that lives there, and the regulations that were put in place to limit groundwater pumping during times of drought to keep that spring flowing. And it's because of this slimy salamander. And I just never understand, because I feel like, people are the ones that are ultimately deriving the benefit from that, and so I've never understood why it takes kind of protecting a salamander for us to realize that, we should want to do it for ourselves. And so, I think like the rights of nature, I mean, that's a noble cause, but we should want to like ensure that that water is there for us, probably more so. And so that's kind of where, we're focused.
It seems like if it wasn't a recent federal court ruling that Pablo Escobar's invasive hippos in South America are considered persons. Why not the Blanco River?
Well, another question is, what rights do we have as the HOA where they are wanting to cross our entry street, I guess for improvements, and what rights do homeowners have? We are in the Trinity Glen Rose Water District. So
well, I will say the groundwater conservation districts are not involved in that type of issue. They're not the ones that are permitting pipelines or approving utility easements. So, that's not going to be the entity that is going to be involved there. That seems like a question that would be better directed toward an HOA lawyer, because it's really if you're talking about like a groundwater pipe, even that pipe, it's not going to be the groundwater conservation district. They're going to be focused on the well and the production from the well. And they may have authorized the transportation to leave the district, but they're not authorizing the pipeline itself. That's going to be a different entity.
Let's see, and I'm seeing, what about issues of industry coming in to watersheds and wastewater discharge? Is that something completely separate? We have some questions on that.
There's certainly a groundwater component to that. So there's concerns particularly in the hill country with wastewater discharge. The traditional way is you discharge it to a creek or a river. And maybe that's fine in some of the other rivers in the state, but in the hill country with all the nutrients, you can get algal blooms that can really gunk up the creeks. There's also some concerns over, other things that are in the water, like pharmaceuticals and things like that. And so where a river, like in the hill country, it may flow along and then it'll sink underground into the aquifer. And so that can affect people's wells. And then it'll come back up again out of a spring. And so, for example, at San Marcos Springs, which, by the way, that's which is behind me, they detect micro levels of pharmaceuticals.
Then there's another one, and Robert, you kind of commented on it, but I thought I would share it for the group. A private eminent domain company has acquired rights to a well farm just south of Camp Bullis in the San Antonio Bexar County area. They issued claims along 6 miles in the city of San Antonio and many more miles into Comal County, just north of Bexar County. I'm guessing, so, and you were saying, I guess, why don't you repeat that, Robert? And
Sure. Yeah, it was a little hard to kind of tell what exactly the question was, but as Vanessa had mentioned earlier, the permitting, how much you can pump from the Edwards Aquifer is pretty much capped. I mean, there are exempt wells that can continue to go in, but for the most part, it's capped. And so hopefully, from their perspective, hopefully when they bought the well farm, they also got the groundwater rights, because sometimes the groundwater rights can be severed from the surface. And then perhaps the comment about them kind of stretching out, maybe that's an eminent domain on transporting groundwater. Generally, groundwater districts, I guess groundwater districts can't prevent the export of groundwater. the Edwards Aquifer Authority is a little unique in that you can't transport Edwards groundwater outside of the Edwards Aquifer Authority footprint, but that sounds like that's internal to the authority's regulatory footprint.
I think, I'm not 100% sure from the question, but I think the question might be about some wells that are near Camp Bullis. They're actually in the Trinity.
Okay.
And they're the Trinity Aquifer. They are not subject to regulation by the Trinity Glen Rose Groundwater District, because when the district was formed, they were grandfathered out. They were at the time capped, but there's a private water developer, I think, who's taken them over and wants to develop those groundwater resources. It's been a while since I've followed what's happened, but I do remember when I was working at TESPA that I had been talking with some landowners who were concerned about that, what that might mean. There aren't a lot of people on domestic wells in that area because it is sort of a more suburban area, and people are receiving water from saws. But I do know that that part of the Trinity isn't very sustainable, or reliable in terms of a water source. But, I mean, I think it's just an example of how difficult it is to sort of balance that property rights and groundwater management. Even when groundwater districts are created, it's an issue. And I'm sure that those wells were left out of the regulatory scheme for that reason. And so, I hope, and it's something that, I intend to work on at EDF, that as we move forward and we have more people that are relying on this resource, that we think more proactively about how it's managed. And, we can't just leave huge segments unregulated. We have to, be thinking about how we manage groundwater in a more balanced way. I mean, there isn't another way, because, you're going to be impacting a lot of Texans otherwise.
Yeah, and just to sort of reiterate something that Vanessa said, just to kind of be clear on the point, Chapter 36 and the legislature when groundwater conservation districts are created, they have the authority to allow for the continuation of historic use. And oftentimes, in many cases, when districts were formed, something that was really important to the community was that those that were already using the resource wouldn't be cut off. And so those historic users in many districts have protection. Their historic use is protected to varying degrees depending on the district. And so that's something that happens out there. And oftentimes it was really an important piece of getting any management structure in place to begin with. If a district were not going to be protective of historic use, they probably wouldn't have overcome that confirmation election hurdle to even be able to regulate. So there's that historical component there, but I think, Vanessa's point being that as we move forward, thinking about how to bring more in is a conversation some districts are having. Some districts do have, if the use is changed, then if you're going to change the use of that historic use, then it's not historic use anymore. You're a new user. So some districts have rules like that in place.
Okay, great. Well, I think that concludes all of the questions from our audience. As I mentioned, all of you watching on social channels, you can email me at jessica@treadcoalition.org or leave comments, and we're happy to get back to you. If any of you would like additional information or would like to be in contact with the panelists after this discussion, please also contact me and I'm happy to connect you. As I mentioned at the beginning of our talk this evening, there is so much to cover in this space, and we're just at the beginning of it. So I do hope to have you all back on in a different capacity, taking a deeper dive into the groundwater issue. But for now, that concludes this TRED Talk on Groundwater 101. So I would like